Right.
Okay, so I present our guest today. Welcome to everyone, first of all, and thank you for being here. Today we have the pleasure and the honor of having Sven Ouzman that will talk about 40,000 years of rock art and placemaking from Sahul and Australia. I introduce our guest today. He's an archaeologist who specializes in rock art, graffiti, heritage politics, indigenous knowledge, intellectual property issues, landscape, creolization, and cross-cultural contact, monuments, origins, and understandings of time. His studies, he made a BA at the University of the Wits University in South Africa. Then he continued his formation in the USA. He has an MA and PhD at the Berkeley University in California, where he stayed from 2002 to 2006 and PhD conferred in 2008. He then returned to South Africa as a senior lecturer at the University of Pretoria's Department of Anthropology and Archaeology, 2006-2011, before becoming curator at archaeology at Iziko South Africa Museum, 2011-2013. In the same year, he joined the Center for Rock Art Research and Management at the University of Western Australia as a Kimberley Rock Art Research Fellow. He currently coordinates the archaeology major, 2015 to present, and he's the director of learning, teaching, and student matters for the School of Social Sciences. He has directed the research in Australia, Botswana, Namibia, and South Africa, documenting over 2,500 rock art sites and producing 234 site reports and conducting 7 excavations. He has produced 31 academic and 83 other publications, established 6 rock art and heritage site museums, curated 8 exhibitions, and trained 53 people. So it is with a great welcome and honor that I give the word to our guest today, Sven Ouzman.
Thank you very much, Matteo, for that very generous introduction. Hello, everyone, buongiorno, and thank you for having me. I understand that the Centro is having a bit of an Australian festival at the moment, with Marisa having given a talk a little while ago on Carnarvon Gorge, and Claire Smith shortly on rock art and Indigenous ways of knowing. My title is probably a little bit naughty. I'm not going to talk about all of Australia, mostly Northern Australia, but it does apply continentally in many cases. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to share the screen and start the presentation so that you don't have to look at me all the time. You can have a look at much prettier rock art. Right, so you should be that should be fine. If not, I think let Matteo know, and then we'll see how it can go.
It is fine. Right. It is fine. I just remember to everyone that is watching that you can comment and ask questions in the Facebook chat. So at the end or during the presentation, Sven will be pleased to answer them. Sorry, Sven.
Yes, so Matteo, if there's specific questions and you think it's a good time during the presentation just to ask the question, just say, well, Sven, stop. I'm happy to do that. And at the end, it's, you know, it's 6 in the evening here. It's a beautiful day. It's the last while we've had 40 degrees centigrade days, but it's very nice now. So I'm very happy to stay as long as we need to stay, or as short if it gets boring. Right, first things. Nala Karich Wajuk, Murtkian Karak, Nija Buja. So I acknowledge the unceded Wajak land on which I am presenting from, as well as the Indigenous and traditional peoples on whose land I do my research. And the talk today is a combination both of research and of management. I'm based at UWA in archaeology and the Center for Rock Art Research and Management. The Center for Rock Center is named like that because we like the research to inform management and social outcomes. And there's still a lot of inequalities in Australian society. And so hopefully rock art in particular, and archaeology in general, can help contribute to just all Australians just knowing interesting things about the past, but understanding their identity in this wider frame and contributing to reconciliation. So thanks very much to the Centro for organizing this, and particular Matteo. Matteo and I originally met years ago in South Africa when I was curator of archaeology there. So it just shows you never know when you might bump in again, and maybe when we, particularly in Western Australia, can travel again, we can meet up. And thank you everyone who's taken the time to be here today. A lot of the work that we do, pretty much all of it, is with partners. We work with all sorts of different people without whom we couldn't get all the work done. So here's just a visual of some of the partners. You can read all the names yourself. It's a combination of governments, of universities, of philanthropy, of Indigenous groups, of government, because rock art is something that is interesting to all of these groups of people for different reasons, but all of them need to come together for this kind of work to happen. Particularly in Northern Australia, it's often logistically quite challenging. It can be expensive. And so it's very much a team effort in the knowledge production and how the work gets done. So thank you to all of these and any other partners I might have missed, but for the purposes of today, I've pretty much got them all. We've been given permissions. All the images I show, I have permission to show. This is more of an issue perhaps in Australia than elsewhere. Many Indigenous people consider images of rock art not images, but the rock art itself as living sentient entities and not something just to put on the internet willy-nilly. So I've got formal permission for both the images in this presentation and for Matteo to put it on the YouTube. But any other use, please ask me if there's an image that looks interesting, and I'll put you in touch with the people that can give the permissions, mostly Balangara Aboriginal Corporation. Further to that, all the work's been carried out with the relevant government permits, as well as the Aboriginal traditions, and I'm not giving away any particular site locations in this talk, though Australia is pretty big, so good luck in trying to find a particular site. That said, there are a hell of a lot of sites, so if you come here, you will definitely find some sites. Today's presentation, you can read all the various bullet points on the screen. Essentially, when Matteo approached me, he said, well, Australia doesn't have a very high profile in terms of its archaeology and rock art in many places in Europe. So I thought I'd spend the initial section of the talk talking about Australian archaeology and histories of research before getting onto the rock art proper, and then ending with issues around management and rock art in society today. Walter Benjamin is my sort of theoretical guide, if you like, particularly from his Berlin childhood. Published 1935, he talks of the importance, you can read the quote there, but he talks of the importance of getting lost in a metaphoric, theoretical way, of not following the established paths that are there already, but trying to find new ways of understanding. And the way in which we partner, particularly with Indigenous partners, is one of the ways we get to these new ways. We don't surrender our scientific excellence, but we apply it in a social context that services the social license with which we operate. All right, so number one, Australia. So what exactly, I've got Australia in inverted commas there, because most people are familiar with this one, the iconic view of Australia that pretty much everyone knows. What everyone might not know is that this view only applies for approximately the last 6,000 or 7,000 years when the ocean level stabilized. So it's only way back 120 something thousand years that Australia looks like this again. So this iconic view of Australia is only 6,000 years, which is a small fraction of the human and geological history of the continent. If we have a look back in time to the Pleistocene at around about 65,000 years ago, it's no longer Australia. And the name we use is Sahul. You'll see it's joined to Papua New Guinea, large inland lakes. Note that there's never a land bridge with island Southeast Asia. There's always at least about 90 kilometers of open ocean that would have to have been traversed. But the point of this is simply to show that the first people coming to Australia, at least in an archaeological understanding, maybe 65 or more thousand years ago, would have encountered a very different landmass, a very different climate and topography. Northern Australia, in particular, is very climatically diverse and dynamic. So you'd need quite a big set of skills to deal with all of those changes and conditions. I then also thought it would be useful in the age of climate change we live in to project forward and to see what Australia might look like 10 to 20,000 years from now if current climate change continues unabated. And the best advice I got here was from an old traditional owner up in the Kimberley, who said, if you're going to buy a house, buy it on a hill. So most of where I am now, Perth will be wiped out, all this coastal plain will be inundated, large parts of Victoria and such will be a large inland lake. So this is just to illustrate the dynamism of the continent in physical form, and then everything that goes with it climatologically. When we look culturally, what I've got here is Norman Tyndall's famous map of the language groups and clans within Australia that he recorded. Over 450 of these, with then sub-dialects and languages, Parmanungan and non-Parmanungan languages, just to show the incredible diversity of people. Languages could be often mutually unintelligible. So just because you are on the Australian mainland doesn't mean you'd understand someone from somewhere else. This has important implications archaeologically, and particularly for rock art, as a kind of signaling device and non-verbal communication in terms of understanding places and identity related to places. And just as an insert, I put here where I am in Perth, on Whadjuk land, there are a whole lot of different language groups that are known. These would be a minimum number that are known. So if this is what it's like in the present, just imagine what it might have been like in the past. Very diverse, as befits a country where you've got essentially a tropical north, large areas of desert, and you get down in Tasmania where it gets very cold, for example. So genetically, people have looked at how, one of the big questions is how Australia was first colonized by humans, by Homo sapiens, and the genetic evidence has suggested these various lines of travel and the sort of dates of in the 50, 60,000 year old range. This is all well-established scholarship, and you probably either know it or you can read up on it. The point of this slide is to show that most Aboriginal people do not subscribe to, for example, an out of Africa and colonization of Australia. It makes for interesting conversations where people say, you know, very interesting account. We love Africa. We love all the Africans today and in the past. But we as Aboriginal people, we know that we come here from Australia. As I say, as an archaeologist, I'll say, well, in terms of evolution, as an Africanist myself, I understand this kind of scenario that you see on the slide to be accurate. But as an anthropologically trained archaeologist, I also understand it's an origin account, an origin story, and every group of people has one or more origin stories. So it's not that Aboriginal people simply reject this kind of view. It is that they have very particular views of where they came about. And if you think of the concept of Aboriginality, that is something that is a sui generis product of the Australian mainland. So they're not necessarily incompatible ways of thinking, but there are sometimes differences between archaeologists and the Indigenous partners we have, and we have interesting conversations around that. This slide is really an animation of the changes in ocean level, for example. The arrow points to the Kimberley, the area in which a lot of the examples for today's talk come. So up at the top here, you can see where the sea level was, 60,000 years ago through to the Holocene, for example. And I'll play it just one more time so that you can see just how much land was lost. So the Kimberley is today about 423,000 square kilometers. It's 3,500 kilometers from Perth, and we're still in the same state. So it's a huge landscape, but at least another 400,000 to 500,000 kilometers is now underwater. So I'll just play the animation again. Lovely animation from Monash University. And archaeologically, our current oldest, somewhat contested evidence for human occupation in Australia is from about 65,000 years ago at a site called Mudjabebe in Northern Australia. It used to be called Malacananga. But what that animation should make everyone realize is potentially there are many more sites underwater, under the ocean. And colleagues like Joe MacDonald in the Centre for Rock Art Research, together with Flinders University and others, are having a look at possible underwater sites and have already found a number. I know this is quite common in Europe, but it really hasn't been done in Australia. And we've got quite different conditions with very severe ocean currents and all of those kinds of things. What I'm going to do now is just do the same again, stop screen share. I'm going to then share an animation that Tom Whitley did of just the Kimberley area. Once I find that, I think it's this one. Yep. And so what this animation is, you can see at the top, there's a time clock from 124,000 years ago. So here is the Kimberley. And if I start playing the animation, you can then see, what you'll see is at various times. So here we're back at about 116,000 years ago. Sometimes the ocean recedes and sometimes the ocean comes in quite quickly. Bits that interest us most are things like the last glacial maximum around 20,000 years ago. So right now, at sort of 90-ish thousand years ago, they're not known to be any human occupation sites in Australia. So this is probably a non-colonized landscape, but that's going to change quite soon now, because now we are in the 70,000s, and bear in mind that Majabebe is here at 65,000. So now we're approaching what the early people would have encountered. So you can see it's really quite different. This is in the Kimberley, so Malakananja, Majabebe rather, is off to the east. And here the ocean is fairly stable for a fair period of time. It oscillates a little bit. And then the next sort of very major change you're going to start to see is as we start heading into the glacial maximum, and it starts sucking up the water and exposing the land. So that's going to start happening quite soon now. There you see this water feature is called the Gulf of Melita. It's now and today underwater, but would have been amazingly resource rich and lots of rock art sites if we use predictive modeling around it. Here we get to ocean level stabilization over the last few thousand years. So hopefully that, no, we don't want any of that, thank you. So hopefully that then just shows the variability of the, stop share, let me share screen and get back to where we were. The variability of the continent. So you should now, we should now be back at the PowerPoints. Matteo, shout out if we're not.
Yes.
Okay, great. And we ourselves in the projects we've been running in the Kimberley, so up here is where I've been talking about, but if you move over west to the Kimberley, we've got a site at about 50,000, a large open site next to the Drysdale River, dated at around 50,000 years ago. So a lot of the research, once rock art research, requires the archaeological context to be established, and then we can better understand how the rock art is working and what its distance to the coast and all of those kinds of things are. So when looked at in broad, Australian archaeology is the first people who come here. They move quite quickly. People like Peter Hiscock have modeled this movement at about, on average, 5 kilometers to sometimes 11 kilometers a year, which is really fast in global context. This shouldn't really surprise us in an archaeological understanding. The people who are here are Homo sapiens sapiens like ourselves. They're well adapted, technologically advanced, and they can cope with a range of different environments. They have to because of the ecological and climatic diversity and volatility. Like with a lot of archaeologies, there is a bias towards rock shelters rather than open sites, though that's changing. And there are lots and lots of topics in Australian archaeology, ranging from this one of first colonization, how people subsistence work, the role of humans or not in megafaunal extinctions, right through to the other end of the continuum in historical archaeology with maritime and contact archaeologies. So the two main journals, Archaeology and Oceania and Australian Archaeology, both with excellent editorial boards and editors, come out regularly, at least 5-6 issues a year combined. And if you're interested, generally just subscribe to those. In terms of archaeology as a discipline, it's really quite recent. Depends how you count. I won't go into it, but you can read Billy Griffith's book that has a fascinating account of the history of archaeology, whereas the other books shown here, Claire and Heather McMorrison's ones about how archaeology is generally done in Australia, and the others on some of the meaty topics in Australian archaeology. So that just by way of general context. And now it's time to get into the rock art proper. So Australian rock art, in terms of its history, is like Australian archaeology, a pretty recent discipline, although it features in Europe quite early. As early as 1903 with Solomon Reinach, who brings in the notion of sort of hunting magic based on his reading of ethnographies that he's read and researched from the centre of Australia. So this hunting magic has been both useful and something of a curse in rock art research. The point here is simply to make that Australian archaeology features in European theorization quite early, 1903, just shortly after Cartillac's 1901 Mea culpa d'un sceptique establishes rock art as legitimate and as a source of evidence of the past. Again, I'm not going to go over this in enormous detail because Paul Tayson and colleagues had a great symposium a couple of years ago on the histories of Australian rock art research. And this will be published this year through Terra Australis for those who are interested in that. So before the sort of professional archaeological era of the last sort of 50, 60, maybe 70 years, rock art research, rock art was characterized by sort of episodic records made by various people, early travelers, missionaries, and so on. And some of them were comfortable with calling it art, and for others, it raised the contradiction in the colonial imagination because being that kind of British colonialism was often quite racist, and they couldn't reconcile how what they considered to be primitive Aboriginal people, obviously I'm using primitive in the sense they thought in inverted commas, could make the sophisticated rock art. And so it led to some crazy theories about foreign non-Aboriginal authors of the rock art, which is total nonsense. So as a couple of examples, this is also from the Kimberley, we've got George Gray traveling up in the north. So George Gray is an important figure in rock art globally. He was governor of New Zealand, of Western Australia, and the Cape of Good Hope, where he enabled the Bleek and Lloyd collection through his patronage of Wilhelm Bleek. What some people don't know is he traveled in the Kimberley to establish a pastoral cattle stations and look at the economic benefit of it in 1837 and 1838. And during this time, in 1838, he records what we today know as Wandjina images. So the images with the big headdresses that people like von Däniken have said were aliens, crazy, but it's prefigured by what people like Gray say in their diaries. So he didn't say it was aliens. He just said in this quote, "It is scarcely probable that they could have been executed by a self-taught savage. Their origin, therefore, I think must be open to conjecture." So when sort of just over 50 years later, Joseph Bradshaw travels in the same general region and finds what have become known as Bradshaw, or in proper name, Gwion or Gudjon images. He also then says at the end of this quote, "Indeed, looking at some of the groups, one might almost think himself viewing the painted walls of an ancient Egyptian temple." So this fed into that weird colonial stereotype. Today, there's no doubt that Australian rock art is Aboriginal authored, and there are many, many different kinds of rock art. Sorry, these are some of the Gwion or Bradshaws encountered by Joseph Bradshaw. The problem is in some sectors of the public, these pseudo-archaeologies still persist, and it's part of our job as archaeologists and rock art researchers to counter these damaging notions. And we can do so with empirical evidence like dating, recording, contextual analysis, ethnographies, and contemporary testimony as well. You'll see, for example, in this picture over here, how human figures have given this very aquiline nose, and they are copied as though you're seeing yourself as the European in them. Anyway, we don't need to spend much more time on these. I've got a slide at the end that explains them. Interestingly, like a lot of rock art research around the world, there was a very strong debt that we owe to female researchers that did enormous work in the two. And so they're quite strong links with Europe. Agnes Schultz comes out in the Frobenius expedition. and is with Goethe Kleist, one of the major copyists for the Frobenius show. Andre Rosenfeld, obviously one of the towering figures that also links Europe and Australia, and then Patricia Vinicum in a more south-south, although she does have a UK link as well, links the two, and there are many others. So again, watch out for that book on Australian rock art research. All right, halfway in and we finally get to Australian rock art, but I thought that context was maybe necessary. So Australia is huge. There's lots of rock art in lots of different forms, so much so that it can challenge our very understanding of what rock art is. The map over here is one that Joe MacDonald and Luthea Clayton did as a report to the Department of Environment and the Australian Heritage Council, just highlighting some, not all, some of the major rock art provinces in Australia. And you'll see it's all over the show, all over the show. People often then ask, what are the dates? And you'll see I've got a question mark rather, from roughly 41,000 years ago to the present. Rock art is still being made today, being both renewed and repainted, and new rock art being made. Essentially, there's a lot of room for everyone to do research, if the government would fund us properly, but I'm sure everyone in every country has a similar lament. So contextualizing it, there's this very useful context that Jane Baum and Peter Veth put together. Jane Baum looking at the various kinds of symbolic behaviors and artifacts such as shell and ochre throughout Australia. But if we have a look at the different kinds of rock art that are thought to be from early on, that's the kind of picture you get, particularly across the north. Though, as I say, people moved through Australia quite quickly, and it wouldn't be surprising to get dates of a similar antiquity from the south, for example. The 41,000-year-old date comes from this piece of limestone that has had ochre applied to it. So it comes from Carpenter's Gap Cave. So that's down here. The 48,000-year-old dates refer to the archaeological deposit. And this was found over 40 years ago in archaeological deposit. So the deposit is 41,000 years ago old. And analysis was done back in the day. You can see here the samples that were removed. With the advances in technology, if it was sampled today, you wouldn't even see those. But the thing is here, it gets very little attention. It is on display in the new museum, Woolabara, here in Perth. So once Western Australia opens to the world, please come and visit, and I'd be happy to, and the curators would be happy to show you around, I'm sure. But I feel this piece of limestone doesn't get the attention it deserves. It's not an image, or clearly an image or a pretty picture. It might have been part of an image. And so it's not that sort of photogenic display you get from rock art. But, should that matter? Should it matter that it's something that we can conveniently see and comprehend? Or should it matter that someone has gone and made an ochre solution, that they've traveled to get the ochre raw material, they've processed the ochre, they've mixed it with a binder, with a loader, with an extender, and the act of applying it to the rock wall, whether it is to make an image or in some sort of performative activity. Myself, I'd argue strongly that should qualify as rock art, but others are perhaps more hesitant. And as I say, it doesn't get as much attention perhaps as it should, but I think it's very healthy for our theorization of what rock art might be globally. So in global perspective, just looking at some of the rock art provinces around the world, obviously there's the controversial Spanish rock art at 61,000 or 64,000, and whether this was Neanderthal or not, again, I think it's useful for the conversation, whether it's Neanderthal or sapiens or not. And then moving to Australia, there's Carpenter's Gap, and obviously all of the wonderful dates that have come out of Sulawesi and island Southeast Asia over the last decade or so. So this is just part of what we do as humans to mark the environment around us. It's not a competition about who's got the oldest. Dates have to be understood both in context and as a continuum. Moving on to the types of rock art, what really excites me about Australian rock art is the many different types it occurs in. So they're the paintings and engravings, and they're sort of subtypes, if you like, stencils, prints, cupules, grooves, that occur here and in many other parts of the world. In rare instances, there have been reports of painted engravings and so on. But then there are other things such as beeswax art, using the beeswax to make paintings that are often thousands of years old, up to 2,000, 3,000, 4,000 years old. Many are not representational. The majority are geometric or dots of beeswax put on the rock. We're still trying to understand what the meaning of those are. The ethnographic accounts and photographs of people making images in the sand, clearing sand to make images, I suppose technically a form of geoglyph. And then what are known as stone arrangements, stones that either stand up as standing stones or are articulated into larger stone arrangements. Now again, whether these can be classified as rock art or land art or not, is an interesting point and has something to pursue theoretically, but they certainly fall within that realm of meaningfully marking your landscape in a social and symbolic way. So I tend to include those in the forms of rock art to have a look at. And in any event, it's part of the larger marked landscape context that we use to understand rock art. On the weekend when I was reviewing this talk, I only had this picture in of some of the rock art types up north, but I put a lot more in. So the next few slides are really intriguing pictures. What you see is this engraving site here in the Kimberley. The engravings are relatively rare, but they're more than people think. Often they're of tracks. So these are macropod, call it kangaroo tracks engraved in the ground. This links to the wider panoramity style that you find in the desert regions, which are dominated by track imagery and some geometric imagery and lines. So very often we find bleed overs from one rock art area into other rock art areas. We've got these examples of wanginas on the ceilings of paintings. Both of these are several meters long, for example. And then there's still a lot we don't know. So the image on the right of screen, as you face the screen, of this long white thing with all of these red objects, we don't quite know yet. This falls within the Wandjina period, so probably the last 6,000 years. These are probably, the red is probably representing red cockatoo feathers, and this long, what we are calling torso, ends right at the bottom in a single foot. So it's an intriguing category that fits within an established style, but is of a type that we don't know very well. We also have some debated images, for example, of extinct fauna, of the marsupial lion, Thylacoleo, Genyornis bird. There are quite a number of thylacines as well, although that's a fairly recent extinction. So this is a painting from up in the Kimberley, in the area in which we work. And you know, the thing with these extinct fauna is, if you want it to be an example of extinct fauna, acknowledging that rock art is not a photograph of what's out there, it's gone through a series of cultural filters. If you want this image to represent a Thylacoleo, you can find enough characteristics and attributes that convince you that it is a Thylacoleo. Equally, if you are skeptical that it's a Thylacoleo, you can one by one demolish each of those characteristics as well. Overall, we don't have a lot of extinct fauna depicted in the rock art, but we do know that the megafauna were around at the same time people were around, but there were selective choices about what was depicted or not. Here, these are just pictures to enjoy of different kinds of rock art we find across our study area. These are largely the anthropomorphs, although this one off on the left is painted, but is very similar to some desert motifs that we find to the south and to the east of the area in which we're working on. These figures with the white dots around them are known to be quite recent paintings. Sometimes they're associated with named individuals, which is very exciting for rock art, which we very seldom get to that level of resolution. And then white on the right are what we call phytomorphs, or plant-human conflations. One of the themes I'll talk about is plants in rock art. So this is some of the more recent imagery that we find. There are various visual cues, such as the 1 foot and that link to examples in ethnography. We always work in the field with traditional owners and before and outside of the field and co-publish with them. That's an essential part of the work. These are the well-known Guion images, previously in the old colonial language called Bradshaws, so Guion or Kujon, a number of other proper language names. Very formal images, very showy images, very so not restricted, but they're very clear about the kinds of conventions, the things you could do or could not do with these. So we really enjoy recording these in the field. Here, Leah Umbagai is making, she's a celebrated artist and traditional owner in her own right, recording a large Wandjina figure that has many multiple layers of repainting going back into antiquity. In some cases, these layers of repainting can be 20 and 30 layers thick as people renew their relationship with that Wandjina, with the land, and with the forces of that country. As archaeologists, we come along and we both record the rock art and we can do things like excavate. So here, excavating on the Drysdale River, you can see the Wandjina imagery here on the ceiling. This has been directly dated. Some of those, they're about 300-400 years old. And then we excavate over here. So we actually had 2 excavations here as part of the team. You can see here's Bruno David excavating, there's Peter Veth excavating, and we were trying to establish different things. So the UWA trenches were having a look at chronologies, going down, finding interesting things like imported crystals, quartz that was brought into the site. Bruno situated his trench here because you can see it's below a weathered but painted rock wall, and is looking for fragments of that rock wall. Very meticulous excavations, and ended up finding individual splashes of pigment from when people painted here, and it fell into the archaeological layers. There's also a grindstone that you see here that was taken out, and which people ground ochre and other substances on. So we can then combine the 2 forms, the excavation-centric form of archaeology and the rock art form of archaeology together. There are also cupules, which you find in many parts of the world, these semi-spherical hollows engraved into the walls. They actually go below the surface. We did an excavation over here, and you can see from the patination that some are older and some have been renewed. They're associated with these apertures or holes in the rock, as Paul Tayson, Richard Fulligar, Ken Mulvaney, and I published some years ago. Jean-Jacques Delanois recording this. I should mention, in this previous instance, in this site, Jean-Jacques was able to find evidence people had moved large rocks around in modifying that site, for example. In this lower slide, though, with these cupules, you can see these little red marks. These are people's thumb and fingerprints that they've made in the cupules. Really intriguing, and literally a fingerprint on the past. And in our excavations, we found this beautiful biface point in the excavations. So we've actually already been in the Kimberley, but let's go to the Kimberley proper and have a look at some of the themes and such like that we are finding. So here's working with rangers, recording the rock art. Again, the same sort of thing about excavating. Those crystals I mentioned here, you can see, in this case, Peter holding those crystals. And you get to really interesting landscapes with the Drysdale River or Mararan and this beautiful complex panel of rock art here. But that's what it looks like today. And this image, which I'll show in a few slides' time relative to Kimberley rock art dating, is showing the current coastline, but then the other coastlines that would have been there. So the area in red on the slide is largely the area that I'm talking about today. 2 projects are on the go here. These are multi-partner Australian Research Council projects that have many, many different partners. One is called Kimberley Visions, run by UWA, and looking at the archaeology and rock art of the Far Eastern Kimberley. And then there's the Rock Art Dating Project, which is run out of the University of Melbourne, but the people from both teams are on the other teams. We share knowledge, resources, all of those different kinds of things, working up in the field, and have been doing so on and off since at least 2012, but formally over the last 6 years with formal agreements with the Indigenous rangers, corporations, and so on. And really quite a lot of work has been done over here. We produce after each field season these posters for the communities we work with. The trick here is to have lots of people pictures, and then you have the rock art and things like that. My partner's luckily a photographer, so she gets the job of putting these all together, and they're then sent to community. And they're a nice visual record of what's been going on. So sometimes it's more of a rock art trip. Last year was more of a community trip, engaging with schools and those kinds of things, and communicating the findings of our research, although at all times in the field we're with traditional owners. Don't worry about all the gory detail here. This is not a boastful slide. This is simply to show the number of days in the field and sites and such like. So we've recorded in call it 6 years, about 1,400 sites. Not all rock art sites, but the majority of sites. So that gives an indication of the richness of this part of the area. And it's by no means a comprehensive survey. There's still large areas that have to be surveyed. We've recorded sites, we've excavated, we found things with quarries. We've plugged in a number of postgraduate researchers into there, as well as international and national researchers to, it makes it's really exciting work when you're working with all of these different people who've got all of these different ideas, and you get to the privilege of going on very beautiful country as well. So the Kimberley has many, many rock art styles. Previously, researchers, avocationalists like Graham Walsh said there were 6 styles. There certainly are those 6 styles, but there are many others. So Ben Gunn and colleagues, for example, recently identified what are called Kimberley stout figures that add to the style sequence. The style sequence is also not necessarily simply stratigraphic, in that peg cupules are thought to be one of the earliest forms of rock art or rock marking, but they're clearly made throughout the sequence as well, as are things like handprints and hand stencils. And the available dating indicates that even in one style, it could occur or reoccur in an area or several areas at different times in some cases, and there are probably overlaps between styles. We estimate at least half of the imagery we find in shelters does not fit into one of the currently known and accepted styles. So it's a very exciting time to work in this field, because you get new things all the time and you figure out how to fit them in. So key to this is dating, to understand how old they are. So recently a number of papers have come out on this, and 2 of the papers are, first was the paper on the guions, on the so-called Bradshaws. So Damien Finch, here in picture over here, pioneered a technique whereby mud wasp nests can be dated not by optically stimulated luminescence dating, although that is part of the rock art dating project's work, and more on that will be published soon, but on the radiocarbon, on the AMS dating, because there are all sorts of little organic bits that are included in mud wasp nests, and as long as your nest is either under or over a painting, such as the case here, you can get a maximum or minimum date. And so with a huge amount of effort for his PhD, Damien and partners were able to show that guions date to around 12,000 years ago, although there are also some outliers to that. And then that what is known as the regular infill animal period, these large naturalistic animals, were produced around 17,000 years ago. And so this graphic, which you see again, just models where the ocean would have been. So for the 17,000 year one, it would have been really far out, because that is during the last glacial maximum, essentially. So what's important here? So this painting, though in the slide it appears small, it's a 2-meter high macropod, and it's not the only one in the area. There are many others. But the ochre doesn't occur here locally. You have to travel some distance for it. So there have been arguments that during the last glacial maximum in Australia, people were just surviving, kind of thing, just subsisting. But producing a 2-meter long high macropod with bits of material that come in from all over the show, probably with the right ceremony, etc., shows that you're doing a lot more than just surviving. You might even be thriving, for example. It's not that environmentally it wasn't challenging, but by this stage you've already had several tens of thousands of years of occupying that landscape and are used to its volatility and changeability. And so you're very well adapted to it. So we shouldn't be surprised by these kinds of dates, for example. Interestingly, these dates point us to links both across the top end of Australia. So part of the Kimberley Visions project's main hypothesis is that in the past, when more land was exposed as the ocean was lower, what is today the Kimberley and Arnhem Land would have been one cultural block. And you have a similar kind of rock art in terms of those large naturalistic animal figures that then differentiate as through time, as you get more recently, as people start to get more particular social and group identities, populations increase, and so on. The links are not just across the top end of Australia, but between the top end of Australia and island Southeast Asia. At the time people first colonized Australia, we need to be thinking of this northern section as well, because those dates of the warty pigs and such like from Sulawesi, that's in a very, visually anyway, a very similar style to the irregular infill animal period. And though there's 20,000 years between the dates currently, that probably just reflects a lack of dating. And it'd be interesting to know, well, what's the people coming through Island Southeast Asia to Australia probably already had a rock art repertoire. How does that link to the marking of Northern Australia, for example? So the dating allows us to link the rock art to paleoenvironmental information, archaeological information, and more recently in time to ethnographic and historic information. Now I'm going to run through a few themes, not too many. We're at least 2/3 of the way through in the rock art of the Kimberley. And one really nice one is the number of plant depictions that we have. Probably more than any other rock art in the world, we have identifiable plants depicted. Do understand that in many rock arts, for example, plant saps and ingredients might be part of the production of rock art. And just because something doesn't look like a plant doesn't mean it didn't signify a plant to people, for example. But that said, we've got lots of different kinds of plants, particularly in the yam family, depicted in Kimberley rock art. So much so that following on pioneering work in the 80s by Chase and Hines, who talked about domiculture, we like the concept of ecoscaping, in which though people are gatherer hunters, they are not just passive on a pre-existing landscape. They're actively shaping and changing that landscape through fire and through things like weeding, diverting water to naturally occurring stands of things like yams, and possibly even cultivating plant resources through stone structures and such like. And this fits in very nicely with a very topical and current debate in Australian society generally that people like Bruce Pascoe have brought out in his Dark Emu book. If you haven't read it, it's a good read. It probably should be paired with Bill Gamage's Greatest Estate that uses a lot of historic sources to make a similar argument. What's interesting is a lot of people don't want to accept that Aboriginal Australians could have been anything other than hunter-gatherers. But for example, over east, we have the Budge Bim eel traps, massive stone structures, complex stone structures made for industrial level production of eel and other freshwater resources for people. People were certainly manipulating the landscape a lot and through fire too, an issue I'll get to in the management section. So we've got a lot of nice plants in the rock art. That's a really interesting theme to follow. Another theme to follow in the Kimberley are more in Arnhem Land, Pilbara and elsewhere, so-called contact rock art, in which Aboriginal people depict non-Aboriginal people, not just Europeans. There is this, Al Patterson and colleagues up in the Pilbara have found an engraving of what they argue convincingly to be an image of the mermaid, Philip Parker King's naturalistic expedition boat. But then moving over to the east to Arnhem Land, Paul Tayson and colleagues on this Arnhem Land is known for its contact rock art. This very detailed ship that you have there. They have another depiction of a Makassan prow, so people from Indonesia, from Makassan, who were trading with Northern Australia for trepang, for beach sea cucumber rather, trochus shell and other things. We've got a date, a radiocarbon date on beeswax on top of a prow at least 600 years ago. And if that date went back, other dates went back to a few thousand years ago, that wouldn't be surprising. And this in fact feeds into very recent, as in the current issue of Australian Archaeology, what we understand by contact between Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal people. So that fits into both rock art and general archaeological theorization. And then the last one I want to show is just the title slide, or the publicity slide for this talk, is about maintenance of country. So country with a capital C is that living, nurturing chunk of land, spirit, resources, themes that nurtures you as an Aboriginal person and towards which you have some pretty heavy duty obligations. When you look at this site, Pundoa Mangur, in Queenie language, and there'll be an article out on this later in the year, is what's interesting here is it's a very large macropod, more or less life size, but if you look at it closely, the orange paint is on top of older mulberry colored paints that you see there. And in fact, Ben Gunn, who's analyzed this in great detail, has at least 4 different episodes of repainting and or engagement with this image. So it's not just the case of painting an image and then you're done. It's of coming back to sites and doing other things, not just repainting them. So over here, you've got some Guion images, some of those dates that were used in the 12,000-year-old dating come from here. You can see all the mud wasp nests here on the site, lots of stencils. Another intriguing form, there's a hand stencil over there, another intriguing form of engagement with the rock art is the hammering of the rock with a stone. So this is not modern vandalism by non-Aboriginal people or in the last few hundred years, but if you look at this macropod's hind leg, or if you look at all of these bats or flying foxes, you'll see they've been bashed or hammered in a very targeted way on their bodies. So this isn't simple trying to efface the image. A scraping technique would work better for that. But there's some as yet unknown way in which people are engaging with the site and with the rock art on multiple occasions through time. And so this is just one of those useful ways of indicating ongoing Aboriginal maintenance of their estates. That leads into a bit on rock art management, which is really important. There's no point in doing the research unless it has a whole lot of outcomes, including management as well. And we're very fortunate here in that the groups we work with all have what they call healthy country plans. So the idea here is that country is living, country is sentient, you and country have a relationship. And if country is healthy, then you and your group will be healthy as well. And there are a number of it set out in a way any kind of land manager, whether you're Aboriginal or not, can understand. You've got various conservation targets, and I've highlighted a few here, and their various aspects and what their relative health is, from poor to very good, for example. So when we approach Aboriginal groups to work with, they'll often say, well, in our healthy country plan, we think this is important. Can you do something with this? So here on this slide, this map over here, which highlights the area of the Kimberley we've been working in a so-called heat map to show areas of higher and lower concentration of higher density of archaeological sites. This is extremely useful to land managers because they then know where the areas are that have a lot of sites, where areas are that are unsurveyed. So over here, just because there are no hotspots over here, that's simply because we haven't surveyed there or only had just very brief surveys. But it helps, for example, if someone wants to come and do some mining on your land, and whether you can then tell them very early on in the process whether it's likely to be in an area that's sensitive or an area that's not sensitive. So we use these healthy country plans a lot. On the ground, they're framed within larger issues such as climate change and archaeology. I'll talk about fire in a moment, but just a couple of years ago in 2020, a public rock art site over, Marisa might have mentioned this a few weeks ago, were burnt down. And increasingly from whether it's extreme heat, whether it's rising ocean levels, whether it's retreating glaciers, whether it's fire, we face a number of quite severe challenges. There is a well-established scholarship on this now, including understanding the Anthropocene is not just something that started in the recent times, but goes back at least maybe 20,000 years ago, when we started agriculture as a sustained form of life. Our contribution to this is what we call encultured burning. So fire is a major issue throughout Australia. As I speak, there are a number of out-of-control bushfires in Western Australia. And up north, there are a lot of fires as well. Other places, California, have been talking to Indigenous owners there, the problems they face. The thing here is fire is often said to be a threat to rock art. So in this newspaper article here, it says a lot of rock art sites have been destroyed by fire. Now, in the research we've been doing over the better part of the last decade in the Eastern Kimberley, where fires come through areas most of the year, we've not found any real evidence of fire damaging rock art, at least visually. We are launching a research project to look at the chemistry of the rock and those kinds of things. But we want to kind of flip the narrative and say, fire can be a tool for the positive management of rock art if you do it in the right way. So for example, if you do heritage surveys and know where your rock art and archaeological sites are, you can then communicate with the people doing the prescribed burning and tell them areas where they should either avoid them or they need to go in and do hand burns, or conversely other areas where it's fine to do aerial burns. But it's not just the burning and the protection of sites, that management, that are the benefits here. It also helps people fulfill, Indigenous people, Aboriginal people, fulfill their obligations to sites by visiting those areas When people are out on country, particularly the old people who sometimes cannot get out on country, are reassured that their estate, their country is being looked after. And that has real health benefits, and particularly for mental health and anxiety. Aboriginal Australians make up less than 3% of the population, but have a hugely high disproportionate percent of national suicides, incarceration rates, poverty and such like. So people are under a lot of stress. But the rock art, going out on country, all of this work that gets done with people, it brings a direct income. We pay people, and it informs tourism ventures and those sorts of things. But it also helps with people's health. Also with our project partners like the Department of Parks and Wildlife, it helps inform their policy around cultural sites, which tends to be underdeveloped. There are also issues around mining. The Kimberley is very rich in all sorts of minerals, gold, platinum, bauxite, diamonds, all of those kinds of things. And mining companies are always looking to do business there. Aboriginal groups are not necessarily against mining. It can bring in a lot of employment and income that can be then invested for the future. But they do want to know how it's going to affect cultural heritage in particular. So the work that we've been doing has been useful here in that there've been two very dodgy mining applications over large parts of the area in which we work. And we've been able, through showing those sites that we record, the detailed site records, the GPS coordinates, to show the important areas on the landscape and the fact that the mining in these cases will have a very deleterious negative effect on the landscape. So the good successes there. The only problem here is that the way in which the miners came to us, they said, we've asked the traditional owners of that country if those areas are important. They said they are important, but we would like you as archaeologists to prove what they said. Now, we found this very distasteful and objectionable. We're archaeologists. We are not in the business of proving or disproving someone's knowledge. What we can do is do archaeology and show sites through site records, GISs, and those kinds of things. So there's still a way to go, but that's useful. So in addition to that earlier one I showed on the outputs, as important are the community outputs of projects, how many days you get people out on country away from the towns, for example, establishing a discoverable database of sites, helping with ranger training, engagements with schools, and then engaging in two-way learning that I'll get onto in a moment, as in this next slide. We have the Australian Archaeology Skills Passport of the Australian Archaeological Association, borrowed from the UK model. Georgia Stannard and Mel Marshall worked very hard to get this together. And it's a great example of two-way learning. Two-way learning simply being that, as you learn, as you teach, so you learn kind of thing. African context, it might be called something like Ubuntu. But in this document, I, for example, can sign off on a ranger's competency using a GPS. But the ranger has to sign off on my cultural competency, for example. So there's no boss person, or the boss, as it were, is only there in particular contexts. We each have something to learn from each other. People are very keen for the scientific dating to take place, for the samples that we take. Over 600 samples have been taken, and they fit into a small Ziploc bag. And most of those samples have been removed by traditional owners themselves, for example. Just broadening the scale from the Kimberley, although the iconography here is from the Kimberley to nationally, there are moments like the 2000 Olympics where rock art is used in a kind of reconciliation and nation building way. And, we savor these when they happen. It's very uneven though. There's still a lot of challenges. So here in this slide, here in Australia, we currently have no rock art sites that are on the UNESCO World Heritage List. The next slide, which I'll get onto, is Murujuga is on the tentative list, and almost certainly will get onto that list. But we are in 2021. Valcamonica was put on the list in 1979, for example. Not most of those sites. Sorry, say again.
No, go ahead. It's
oh, righto. So though Australia has a lot of rock art, most Australians don't know a great deal about Australian archaeology or Australian rock art. I'm often in the Kimberley, and German, Italian, etc. visitors know a great deal more than the average Australian up there. So we've got a great deal of work to do. Part of this is government indifference, for example. I'm sure everyone moans about the government not supporting their work enough, but we don't have funded centres. Though I'm a member of the Centre for Rock Art Research and Management, we don't get a sum of money for the centre. We get project-specific funds, and the university pays our salary, for example. So we need a lot more accessible sites for people, for example. As I say, Murujuga will come in for that quite soon. And so they're through the hard work of many Indigenous people and academics here from UWA, that's now starting to happen. We still have this larger project of managing the various kinds of misperceptions, like I mentioned before, the notion that non-Aboriginal strangers came to Australia and made some of the rock art, as you find in parts of Africa, North America. So it's a particular pathology, I think, of British colonialism. And Ian McNiven puts it very nicely, where he talks about manipulation of the past being a powerful weapon of the colonizer. You have this double move where you deny local authorship of an archaeological phenomenon like rock art, and then you bring in some exotic foreigner, pointing out that when you have periods of political conservatism, these misperceptions tend to increase. That said, in the school syllabus in Australia, there's quite a lot of archaeology now and rock art and Aboriginal knowledge. And so I think the future is looking quite good. It's everyone that's aged sort of maybe 40 and above that we still have a problem with the misperceptions. And so for all that, I'd like to put as a kind of last word, or almost last word, the resistance to those views in Aboriginal views. So this is an Aboriginal artwork from Mowanjum Centre about this notion that aliens, as in aliens from out of space, came and made Wandjina rock art. It's labeled, Adam Risch and Lily Karagada made this wonderful piece in the late 90s. It's called Chariots or Weavers, as in the Weaver barbecue of the gods. And they find it extremely funny that Europeans should think that Wandjina were made by anyone. Wandjina are not made by anyone, Wandjina just are. And so they don't pay much mind to this at all, for example. And then my last slide is, I thought, given that the Centro was so kind to extend this invitation, is looking at, we might do some more research looking at Italian archaeological overlaps. So most people may or may not know, but that there are a great many artifacts, particularly from Northern Australia in the Vatican, and there's this wonderful book on it, and there are a couple of exhibitions on it, and possibly future research can have a look at it. We certainly enjoy the interchange. One of our PhD students, in fact, on the Kimberley Visions project, 3 out of the 4 students are from respectively Argentina, France, and Italy, with 1 Australian. So we enjoy that interchange, and once the borders open, hopefully we can all visit each other, and hopefully you can come to Australia and have a look at wonderful rock art, maybe more than just look at it, bring your various expertises and help advance our understanding of it. So on that note, grazie. Thank you for your attention. And if there are any questions and such like, I'd be happy to take them.
Thank you, Sven. Terrific presentation. We all hope to come and visit Australia again. And also we hope that you from Australia can travel again.
Yes.
Yes, exactly. It was very wide, very interesting. There were many comments while you was talking. I decided to keep some of them for the end. When you started and you was talking about the permission you have to receive from the community, from the Aboriginal communities. There has been a comment that maybe it's not true, maybe they are images that are in the public domain and that anyone can use. Could you address this topic briefly? So it can also be good for sensibilization on this subject.
So it is a hot topic. It's often a very controversial topic, and there's very much the letter of the law. So what things like intellectual property law say. So things like intellectual property law will often say copyright exists in a work for the duration of the life of the author plus, and then it can vary between 50 and 100 years after their death. So you could say, well, rock art, some Australian rock art is authored by people within the last 100 years, and so you'd need copyright, but the vast majority is older than that, and so therefore in the public domain. So in a strict legalistic sense, that's true. Nonetheless, when you're working with, we're working with people who, we call it rock art, but in Aboriginal Australia and, in a previous life working in Southern African sand rock art, it was clear that these weren't just images. They look to us like images, but in many cases, using ethnography, we could understand that for the people making them, they weren't in their minds making a 2D representation of a 3D thing out there. They were assisting in bringing something to life or bringing something to the site or assisting its manifestation at the site. And so as a result, people then say, in Aboriginal Australia, there's a very strong cultural prohibition in many parts that you can't have photographs of a deceased person, at least for a certain period after their death, because that's very powerful. Images can be used to bewitch people. They can if you act the wrong way to an image, if you do not renew a painting. So another one that was very controversial was the renewing of ancient paintings. But if you don't do that in an Aboriginal understanding, you break that contract with the country, and you then experience negative effects, real negative effects like health effects in your life. So when we work with people, they say, righto, you consider them images. We do want you to take lots and lots of photographs. We don't, though, want you to distribute them without us knowing how you're going to distribute them. So we have a formal research contract with everyone we work with, a memorandum of understanding, and a member of our research team deals with image and article and information permissions. Currently, Martin Paul deals with that. So people want to know, how is that being used? So those wandjina, for example, there are rules about wandjina belong in certain places, and certain people can make them. Now, you can buy wandjinas by people like, you saw Leah Umbagai. She is an artist in her own right and sells wandjinas all over the world, but she's the right person to do that. Me, I'm not the right person to do that. If I want to do something, I have to ask permission, and people will then either say yes or no. And of course, in the world we live today with the internet and everything, once an image becomes digitally reproducible, it is very, very difficult to police what's going on there. We are working with Indigenous Property Australia to try on, like the TM or R trademarks. We're trying to get that both for research, potentially research projects, but certainly for images, so that you can watermark them, so that people looking at those are confident that the correct permissions have been used, that image is being used in an ethically correct way. Legally, around copyright, there are always loopholes. If you just change a small detail in an image, it is no longer the original image, and you're generally free of a lot of the copyright or author right kinds of issues. You might have known recently that the iconic Aboriginal flag, the famous Aboriginal flag, the red, yellow, and black flag, was owned by a particular person, and just now this past, or was it last week or the week before, it has now been, the rights have been bought by the Commonwealth, and it can be used by everyone, because until then people were being prosecuted for using that flag. So yes, you can probably use any rock art image you find on the internet in any way you want, and you'll probably be legally okay. But certainly in terms of the ethics of it, it would be very questionable, and you wouldn't find any reputable Australian researcher, no Australian archaeologists, because we belong to the Australian Archaeological Association, that is a pretty strict code of ethics, would use images or information without people. But what it has done is opened a really exciting way in which we are now having Aboriginal partners as our co-authors. Following the Vancouver Protocols, we now list them as co-authors, both as individuals and in our case as Balangara Aboriginal Corporation. In another project I'm working on in the West Kimberley, the Fitzroy River, or the Modawarra, has recently been credited as an author to acknowledge the sentient nature of that river, for example, which I know might blow some people's minds. But it really actually opens a quite interesting set of questions into knowledge ownership, and essentially as well post-humanism in some ways.
Just a curiosity, have you ever been answered no, or do you know other researchers that have been answered no on images, and on which basis was that?
So sometimes people will say no because, for example, the image, or what we call the image, falls into restricted. So only if you've been through initiation are you meant to see that image. You can have women or men business images that are not meant to be seen by the other gender, for example. And so people, I must say, it sounds as though people are acting as sort of very resistant to having their images and that shown. The reason they engage with partnerships with us is they want their culture to be known more widely throughout the world, but they want it to be known in the right way. And this is a way in which they can ensure, what they're actually saying is, if you don't use that image in the right way, you break the contract with country. That comes back to us as Aboriginal people and affects us. And we believe it will affect you as people as well. So it's actually a duty of care. They're looking after. So it's actually done out of love, not out of sort of just a sort of police person kind of thing. But yet people regularly do say no, and then you have to negotiate in other ways of showing the image, for example, or a similar kind of thing. Or sometimes you have to do without.
Interesting.
It's very hard in a visually saturated world to get your head around that, but I think it should be part of the ethical training of any archaeologist and art researcher.
Yes, of course, respect to the original spirit of some creation. There is a comment. I cannot really contextualize it. Maybe I skipped some detail, but I'm sure you'll catch it. So I read it as it's written here. So I think it's quoting an article, Farmer or Hunter Gatherers by Peter Sutton and Karen Walsh in 2021. And then the comment says, Aborigines were specialized hunter and gatherers. They did not domesticate animals or sow and care for crops. Pascoe fudged the journals. I don't know if that's
so this is what I was referring to earlier when I was showing Dark Emu, for example, or Gamage's earlier book, Greatest Estate. What you have is that sort of traditional kind of Eurocentric notion of hunter-gatherers kind of progressing to farmers or so on. But that has been challenged in a number of places in the world. Now, in this particular case, so Bruce Pascoe's work has been controversial and has been challenged by, for example, Sutton and Walsh. And there's a very good review of Sutton and Walsh in the latest Australian archaeology. So Pascoe, as a lot of what he writes is also written as a kind of provocation to get people to think about this notion of hunter-gatherer. He says, you're not just going to survive as a hunter-gatherer waiting for the climate to change and then retroactively adapting to it. And so, for example, we've got testimony from George Gray, just here north of Perth, which talks about yam fields. Whether these were cultivated in the sense we mean cultivated, or whether it could mean, for example, so the yam, imagine a tuber, whether people, when they were gathering yams, digging them out as a hunter-gatherer would, and then you break off, for example, the vegetative top, and you put that back in the ground and take the rest of the yam with you, ensuring that there are yams occurring before. We've got other accounts where people will do some weeding around naturally occurring stands of a plant resource to increase the yield of that. As mentioned earlier, going towards the eel traps, there's no doubt with the eel traps that this is large level production of a surplus of, in this case, eels, for example. So there's going to be quite a lot of variability, obviously, across Australia. But I think most people are agreed you don't have just simple hunter-gatherers, is that people are, even in our research, I mentioned Jean-Jacques Delanois and Bruno David's work about how people are manipulating the physical spaces. So if you read particularly on Nawala Garbamang in Arnhem Land, the rock shelters, people are knocking out bits of rock shelters, moving bits around. They're not passively living in that landscape. And that carries through to especially their gathering and their practices, in which they are certainly conducting what is variously being called domiculture or ecoscaping. So it's not simple gathering. There's a lot more happening there. Whether it is crop production in the sense Pascoe means, we're right in the heart of this debate now. Walsh and Sutton's book came out last year, for example. So we're right in the guts of it. I think it's whatever it turns out to be. What I think is it's very useful in making us re-examine our assumptions about hunter-gatherers. So Graham, I forget his surname. What is it again? He was here a year before, just before COVID hit, has a great article on whether hunter-gatherer archaeology exists, or whether this is in part a construct of the theoretical imaginary of this kind of continuum from hunter-gatherer to farmer kind of thing. Remember, in Papua New Guinea and island Southeast Asia, people are doing all sorts of things with particularly yams, and might have been doing, and with interchange between Northern Australia and there, there's no reason why people here couldn't have done it at times. There is speculation that some stone arrangements are in fact mounds made for the growing of tubers, for example. But yeah, so I think it's a really interesting field. I'm certainly for ecoscaping, for the active manipulation of the world around you beyond simple hunting and gathering. Whether it's full-on crop production, we shall see. Certainly people are using fire to increase the yield of plant and animal resources in quite sophisticated ways for quite a long time. So there's that kind of what has been called fire stick farming. Yeah, so you know, let's revisit that question in 2 years' time.
Yeah, probably you already answered. There was a comment to the previous comment from Peter Veth, sorry. So he says that Stephen Bennett and many others find issues with dark ammo. Also series of reviews that see merit in profile and complexity of plant management. So probably you already answered that.
So well, Peter's the one who's written the review of Sutton and Walsh and goes over a lot of the issues. He's also one of the co-authors on the ecoscaping paper. So I won't put words in Peter's mouth, but certainly most archaeologists acknowledge that there was certainly active manipulation of plant and animal resources, whether we call it, you know, crops as such. You could make the argument that that in itself is Eurocentric, because you're reducing hunting and gathering, complex hunting and gathering practices in a volatile ecology to a kind of European norm of farming. And it might be actually more complex than farming. It's certainly not the kind of farming you'd get in Europe. Here in WA, we've had the wheat belt that produces most of the crops cannot operate without huge inputs of organophosphates and such like. So yeah.
Then just a comment from myself, just something interesting to let's say to our knowledge. When you was talking about the packing on rock art on some places, it reminded me when I visited South Africa that there was it was recorded the same technique, that some rock art site was being packed, and I mean the figure, not the site, the figure, so that the pigment would fall, and it could be used as a sort of empowered, let's say, some sort of material that was fulfilled with the power that comes from the site, from the rock art site. And that's maybe an interesting parallel.
Yeah. So in that particular case, the ethnographies of Marion Walsh and Howe and others in Lesotho and adjacent areas of South Africa show that pigment was scraped, was very particularly removed from certain images, and associated historical and ethnographic accounts suggests that this was for use in medicines. Now, interestingly, a lot of the argument is that it was non-San or non-Bushmen removing it, Bantu-speaking African farmers that were moving it and they were acknowledging the power of the painting, and they were using it in, for example, protecting their stock from lightning or in various kinds of medicine. Here in Northern Australia, that picking, you know, and other forms of, they're often incised lines. When you go into the problem with rock art in a lot of Northern Australia is people often look for the very pretty paintings and they ignore these lots of anthropogenic marks, little scrape marks, rubbed areas, hammered areas. So these could be, it could be the act of hammering, or it could be, as you say, a desire to remove pigment, to use that pigment for some other purpose. We know from ethnographies there are things like increase rituals where people will do things like abrade the rock surfaces, and the rock dust is either thrown into the air, put on people's bodies, or a variety of things like that. And so those engagements they're often just referred to by the shorthand of vandalism. But I think, as you say there, we need to look at that much more carefully. And I think there's a whole hierarchy or variety of uses and reasons why people are engaging with this. In this case, the word rock art, we should probably be paying more attention to the rock part of the word than the art part of the word. And these engage these are senses other than sight that are being engaged, and much more performative kind of aspects that are happening there. I should mention that in a lot of the site, there's not only hammering of sites. On some of the rock edges, they've been flaked, as you would flake for a stone tool. Now, very well could be art. It's very convenient for people. They flake it. These are on sandstone shelters, but they've got a lot of quartzite in it, so it's a good raw material. But at the same time, it could also have a symbolic purpose, almost like taking a relic from a holy site. You could have both of those things together. So there's certainly lots of evidence of people being quite concerned with the rock and doing lots of different things to the rock, including rock art.
Thank you. There was another comment from Vesna. So it's two of them that I think they talk about the same thing, or written 15 minutes one from the other. So the first one goes, George Gray never said that in his diaries he ascribed the Vangina paintings to pre-Aboriginal races as confirmed by Aborigines themselves. And the second goes, finally, we get to Graham Walsh, who researched both Vangina and Broadshaw art all his life and proved both were created by pre-Aboriginal races as confirmed and still being confirmed by some sincere Aboriginal people.
Okay, I'm afraid I can't agree at all with either of those statements. As are very detailed, there have been several large archaeological projects up in the Kimberley over the last 20, 30 years. That emphatically show there's absolutely no evidence for non-Aboriginal or pre-Aboriginal people's presence here. The rock art dating firmly, and it's not just the dating, people like Meg Travis's PhD show the continuation from through analyzing the typology of the images and the attributes from one style to another style. There's no big discontinuity. Part of Walsh's argument was that there was a discontinuity and a period of non-Aboriginal occupation. We've recently, in fact, last year, published a paper in the Kimberley looking at archaeological sites, their dating, that shows that at all times Aboriginal people occupation was continuous. So Walsh did a great deal of interesting work. He was an avocational archaeologist. He wasn't an archaeologist. The notion that Aboriginal people themselves say it was pre-Aboriginal is not, in fact, what had been said. The one that is often used is where Walsh is interviewing some people and they say, oh, those are rubbish paintings. They've got nothing to do with us. Bearing in mind you're dealing with people whose English is their second, third, fourth language. Rubbish in Aboriginal English just means it's kind of like white noise. It's not ours. They were talking about Guion paintings. Our dates show that dating project shows conclusively that those are at least 12,000 years old. So Holocene, Pleistocene transition. And who would know exactly an oral tradition that links back 12,000 years ago? Are there any oral traditions in Europe or elsewhere that link back that far? Of course not in that sense. So those notions of pre-Aboriginal or non-Aboriginal races is, I'm afraid, not accurate. Gray, for example, as I showed from that quote, doesn't say it's not Aboriginal, but he is in this colonial mindset where he can't accept that art. So he comes across other rock paintings, which he does attribute to Aboriginal people. But then he comes across the Wandjina and he says, this is a different category of things. And this must have been, this, as that quote says, their origin must be open to conjecture. But bear in mind, that's 1838. We're almost 200 years on from there. And through any number of scientific evidences that anyone can check, there is no evidence of non-Aboriginal people making any kind of this art, and B, multiple sources of evidence from rock art, from ethnography, and from archaeology establishing that Aboriginal people did make this rock art. So that is not a view held by any archaeologists, the pre-Aboriginal, non-Aboriginal view. It's not a view held by any archaeologist on a considered evidential basis. Unfortunately, it's a dissident view held within the field of pseudo-archaeology in Australia and a number of other countries, interestingly enough, characterized by British colonialism.
Thank you. I think I can read the last comment, which comes from Lily, which goes as, anyone was able to fly the Aboriginal protest flag. Harold Thomas created the design, and as he held the copyright since 1974, he rightly sold the license to several companies, one being WAM Clothing.
Yep, so I'm not quite sure what the question was. Could you just read the first part again?
Yes, it's about the, I think when you was talking about.
I think I can cover it though, is that, you know, can you use that flag now today without fear of being prosecuted by any one of those companies that Harold Thomas formally allowed to use it? Yes, you can use it now today. The Commonwealth of Australia has now taken it over because there was a whole Free the Flag movement where people kind of said, a wide range of people, not just Aboriginal people, said it's inconsistent that the symbol of Aboriginal Australia is owned by one person and can only be used under very specific conditions and paying royalties to certain companies. So, you know, in a protest march, could you be prosecuted for using the flag without having prior permission? Technically, probably you could have. I'm not aware of any cases there where it's been done, but certainly cases where there's been merchandise that has been sold. There is a problem where people say, you know, this is an Aboriginal design, and they haven't sourced that design ethically. They haven't paid a royalty to the originator of that design or so on. But the Aboriginal flag, you know, I think it's always good practice to acknowledge the source, even though the Commonwealth of Australia now owns that copyright and author right. I think Harold Thomas should, you know, if you're using the flag in some sort of academic or other context, he's the creator and should deserve the comment. And then you can put in the Creative Commons license type for that there. But yeah, I think, you know, pretty much everyone in Australia is very happy that that flag has now been freed, more or less. People might not be that happy with the government. Many Aboriginal Australians say, as they point out to me, they say that is your government. We still have our own forms of government and law. There's a dual government system, you know, noted, point taken, but it's certainly much freer than before. And I think it's the usual kind of thing of using an image clearly what the intent is and in a respectful way.
Thank you, Sven. Of course, so you received a great number of compliments and many people saying thank you for the very clear presentation. I think for me, that's all. I don't know if you wanted to add something.
No, other than, you know, if people want to chat at any time, just, you know, send me an email you know, I'm always happy to chat rock art, heritage, any of those kinds of things. I should have thought about it. I've just put what I'll do is I'll end off with thanks to you, Matteo, and to the Centro and to everyone who's given up their time. I'll just share screen again with my last slide, which has my email address, and you're welcome to contact me there. Even better, as I say, when things open up, hopefully we can travel to Europe and you can travel to here, and that'll be the best. Thanks very much.
Yes, of course. So thanks to you, Sven. We are very pleased of having this presentation of the rock art from Australia. It's been very clear and very complete. It has been followed very much. And it raised many questions, as you could also see from the ones that I asked you. So thank you. Hope to see you soon. Thank you for your generous answers also to the questions. And bye.
Bye. Thanks. Have a good lunch or dinner or whatever time it is, wherever.